we'll start with a prayer, and then I'll introduce Paul. And this is a prayer that Catherine found for us. Forgive all of humanity, Lord God, our Creator. In haste and hunger for progress, we've laid waste the good earth you have made. We have mined landscapes, spoiled coastlines, and polluted air and water. We've brought health and wealth to some, and suffering and deprivation to others, exploiting the earth and threatening its creatures. Make us hungry now for restoration. Be with Paul as he speaks to us now, and enable those of us listening to learn from Paul's work, to call out injustice and danger, and to redress the imbalance. So a very warm welcome to all of you who've stayed up to 8 o'clock to join us this evening, and a very warm welcome indeed to Paul. Paul is a long-time member of Green Christian, so it's lovely to have him giving us a talk. He lives in rural Shropshire with multiple parishes. The vicar, he's been working on creation care for 30 years. Now, after working abroad and seeing how climate change was impacting on 3 continents. And back in Shropshire, he uncovered secret government GM crop plantings, leading to a National Journalism Award, and exposed a nuclear lobby initiative on General Synod's ecological motion. And his current research he's going to share with us a bit tonight. And then there's going to be an article in Green Christian magazine that you'll receive around about Easter. So his current research is exploring Monsanto neurotoxic chemical waste dumping, which is still leaking into the rivers and estuaries across the UK 50 years on. And this is in advance of a forthcoming major media initiative that he'll share with us a bit about. So we're having a talk from Paul. Then we'll break into breakout groups just for about 10 minutes, like a little buzz group, to have a chat about what he said, come back with some questions for Paul and some things you might like to contribute yourself. And we'll finish 9:15 at the very latest. We'll see how things go, but very latest will be 9:15 finish. So, okay, Paul, over to you.
Thanks for that, Barbara. Well, there's been a lot in the news recently about pollution of watercourses by sewage and also by agricultural pollution. My focus is on the pollution of watercourses by industrial chemical pollution. About 30 years ago, the United Nations Environment Programme wrote a lovely little booklet, which they said called PCBs, a Forgotten Legacy, ? I've been trying to bring back to public attention the PCB problem around UK waters. It was quite dramatically shown up by the fact that the UK killer whale population hasn't had a calf for over 2 decades now. That looks to be likely to be caused by the neurotoxic impacts of PCB, which killer whales as the apex predator are biomagnifying. Those PCBs have been found in juvenile porpoise carcasses, which are washing up over the off the west coast of Wales. I've found 2 myself at Fairbourne, just opposite Barmouth. The UK dolphin population is being found with PCBs in it. Now, this is very inconvenient to the Environment Agency and to DEFRA, because they've been trying to convince everyone that PCBs are a problem which has gone away. There was a load of sites in the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 70s where PCB chemicals were dumped, along with a lot of other persistent organic pollutants, as they're called, about 60 of them, in fact. It looks like when the legislation was going to be changed with the introduction of the Poisonous Waste Act, some of the chemical companies were trying to get the worst of their toxins out of the factory as quickly as they could, so they wouldn't actually have to register them. So there's about 14 or 15 sites I've identified so far. where barreled chemical waste was just chucked into old quarries, and even in one place into literally just a fold in a valley, with no surroundings to it. Um, Metal barrels rust, so now a lot of the stuff which was put into the ground in those barrels is gradually emerging. And I've been doing a systematic survey of which watercourses there's data showing that the PCB is coming into. So far, the main ones that I've found are the Severn Estuary, where it's massively polluted in the sediment below the Newport, which hardly coincidentally is where the biggest PCB factory in Europe was located. The D, there appears to be a dearth of data anywhere downstream from Corwin, which is rather surprising because another of the Monsanto factories is at Cefn Mawr, just about 5 miles downstream. The Tees estuary, I don't know how much you're aware of the wildlife die-offs, the marine wildlife die-offs in the Tees estuary. It looks like PCB may be one of the causative factors of that. And there's been an absolutely massive DEFRA cover-up about that. I've got a whistleblower in CFAS, the research organisation that works for government, and he's been giving me chapter and verse, but he knows if he ever goes on record, it'll be the end of his career. It may also involve extra threats because there's been personal threats to two of the people I'm working with on Teesside. One of them is a senior lecturer at Newcastle University who had significant threats to his funding made and possibly more threats as well. And the other person's a former police officer on Teesside who's had very severe personal threats made to her and her family. And I've tried to get a message through to MI5 to take it seriously. In the Thames, there's a feeder river, the Colne, where there was PCB effluent sent straight out of a paper factory, straight into the River Colne, which is trickling down towards the Thames. In South Wales, most of the rivers are badly contaminated. In the Taff, there was another paper factory there that was discharging PCB effluent straight into that river. And it may be no coincidence that the eels in Cardiff Bay, just above the barrage, are showing high PCB levels. The mussels in Cardiff Bay, below the barrage, have the highest readings that I've come across in the whole UK. The Ely, the Sir Howie, and very diagnostically, the Usk, Natural Resources Wales, claims to have no PCB data for sediment or wildlife for the entire River Usk. Can you believe it? The entire River Usk, they claim to have no data whatsoever. That's the river that runs straight past the PCB factory. And Monsanto had plenty of data. In fact, their head of science even drew a map showing how bad it was at the bottom of the Usk and going out into the Severn Estuary. So there's something seriously fishy there. There's even a consent that was authorised by Natural Resources Wales, allowing the residual company to continue shunting PCB from the factory site straight into the Severn Estuary via a 5-kilometre pipe. Even though PCB is known to be one of the most neurotoxic chemicals of all and longest lasting. It's been quite a pilgrimage, can I put it, actually coming up against this. I mean, Walter Wink has a lovely language for it, doesn't he, about confronting the powers. I didn't expect it to become so personal for me. And I must admit, I don't relish it. I've got quite scared at several points over the last 5 years. The regional director for the West Midlands for Friends of the Earth has been a tremendous support. And the director of the Clean Rivers Trust, Professor Harvey Wood, again, has been a very good emotional and technical support. It's not me being overreacting, saying that I get scared. There was an NFU scientist who had some very nasty stuff done to him when he was trying to expose all this back in the early 2000s, leading up to the ecologist articles about it. There was a court case that was concocted against him, and according to some accounts, he was personally assaulted as well. I make no comment on where that's likely to have happened from. So, it's quite interesting to me on a slightly different note that the NGOs who are reliant on official funding are highlighting agricultural pollution and sewage pollution of the rivers, but making very, very little comment about chemical pollution. It looks increasingly to me like that's because they're worried for their funding. I've had a lot to do with several of the agencies involved, and well, to put it frankly, the spinelessness of some of them has been quite shocking on it. I'm getting some good liaison now with some of the professional bodies, the Chartered Institute of Waste Management and the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management are both launching investigations into this. There was an article that I wrote, which you may have seen, which tried to give a little bit of background. Since that article was written, the scale of the thing has become much, much bigger than I'd anticipated. There's a place in Cheshire, Alvanley, where it turns out that Michael Howard, the Conservative minister, was involved in writing about it when he was Minister for the Environment. And Lord Crick Howell, likewise as minister, was writing about that when he was Secretary of State. And yet the latest FOI response from DEFRA claims they have no paperwork about the site. It looks, I'll choose my words carefully here, it looks exceedingly likely to an experienced amateur that the law is being broken below Alvanley. They prosecuted the owner of the site and then didn't do anything to clean up the site. I mean, or nothing substantial. So I was there with some specialist journalists last month, and we were watching the foam going into the stream. There's a pool of leachate at the bottom of the site where it's just coming out, and then there's a subterranean channel it's sent into, and it goes straight into the stream. Now, as far as I can see from the legislation, that's what's called significant pollution of controlled waters, and it's a cast iron offence. It was so bad, the PCB level was so bad, a local consultancy company was hired in 2009 to send a dredger in to dredge the stream, but they didn't do anything to put a plug in the supply, so it's just still flowing into there. I mean, it would be absurd in any normal situation, but if it is part of some kind of cover-up at national level, it makes a lot more sense. There's another site about 3 miles away from there where they're building a housing estate over the top. There's actually even a PCB waste site in the old factory grounds. All they've done, they've put a 2-inch plastic wrapper and some clay over it, and then they've built a sports club over the top. What life expectancy does a plastic lining have? It's all short-term thinking. PCBs are rightly called a forever chemical. They're now at a stage which is 50 down the lines from where the new chemical lots of people are focusing on getting research grants for, PFAS, where that's at. Some of you might have seen Rachel Selvidge's articles in The Guardian about PFAS, and she's actually down in the Severn Estuary at the moment doing some testing there. So I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that the original forever chemical hasn't gone away. It's still here. It's still affecting wildlife and fish. It's an immunosuppressant. It impacts on reproduction. It also impacts on navigation. I'm a fisherman. When you hear reproduction and navigation are impacted, you think straight away about salmon and sea trout. I've got some data about trout being impacted. PCB concentrates in their livers. There's also very high readings in dabs, because dabs feed on the sea floor, so they'll be eating the crabs and shrimps which have ingested the PCB. So it's quite a complex issue. In terms of spirituality, it interests me that the short-term thinking is being allowed to rule the roost. There's also an element of denial in government policy making. We've been refused access as a part of a country file feature I did about 3 years ago, we refused access to Baroness Barbara Young, the previous chief exec of the Environment Agency. It's unclear why she was reluctant to talk, but I'll leave you to have a think about that. Does that give a little introduction to things, Barbara? Would you like me to pause there for questions, or shall I just carry on talking?
Shall we just have any questions to Paul at this point? Then you've got more to say, obviously, Paul. Yes?
I can talk for England on the subject, so
okay.
I'm at your discretion.
Okay. So, Catherine, did you have a question? For
yes. Gosh, thank you, Paul. So interesting. And wow, informative and frightening. You mentioned some litigation already. Who brought the lawsuit? Have any lawsuits been brought by people whose land or animals have been affected? Your article mentioned a deformed calf.
Yes, Brafiskin was the first one. This NFU scientist, Douglas Gowan, was investigating it, and everyone was trying to poo-poo him in the same way they've tried to do to me. And then the side of the quarry fell in, and a whole load of chemicals went down the ditch, and then they suddenly had to take him seriously. And he'd already got a local vet who'd verified some of the problems with calves. And the Environment Agency then had to come and try and form a remediation plan for that site. What they didn't do was use that as a trigger to try and decide that they needed to remediate the rest of the sites. They tried to pretend that Brafiskin was a one-off, which was a completely amoral strategy, because back in 1973, Brynmawr John, the very assiduous South Wales MP, had actually talked in Parliament about Brafiskin and Maindy as being two sites which were both in need of particular attention. You know, there's been so many warning flags given on these sites that it's incredible that there hasn't been more activity. In America, the amount that's been paid out in compensation for PCB now, one court case alone involved over 2,000 local authorities, and the amount that was awarded by the judge was $548 million. The amount paid out so far in America is now over $2 billion for PCB damage. And yet in this country, there's only been 3 or 4. There's one farmer was rehomed and he was given about 110,000 in compensation. 3 farmers around Maindy were given 50 quid each. They were actually given 100 quid, but it was 50 quid on the record. And there was 1.1 million spent to remediate Brafiskin, which probably needs tens of millions just to get it properly done. So there's a systematic cover-up because they're worried about the amount of compensation which will probably be due. And I can't tell you which organisation, but the Media Initiative in June, the lead character for that is actually on his way to America at the moment to interview some of the PCB victims of Love Canal, which you may have heard of, and around Aniston. And we're going to try and get as much on record as we can and then bring it back here. And then when we do go public about it all, we'll be basically calling the government's hand, saying why, you said in the new environment bill last year you wanted to make the polluters pay, but actually behind the scenes you're doing exactly the opposite in perpetuating a 50-year cover-up.
Wow. Any other questions? Immediate questions? Okay, Tony.
What about people who engage in wild swimming? Are they going to be subject to the effects of PCBs and other chemicals?
It's a very good question. The presenting answer is no, because PCBs are notoriously heavy and insoluble, so they roll along the bottom. And that's why it's so absolutely absurd that the main way the Environment Agency has of testing for PCBs is testing in the middle of the water, nowhere near the bottom. So they come back with loads of false negatives, and they can all pat themselves on the back that there's no problem, because no one will officially admit that their tests are pointless because they're testing in the wrong place in the water body.
Yeah.
But having said that, wild swimmers, of course, have to stand, and any exposure of the soles of people's feet to a neurotoxin, I mean, I'm not sure that's even been researched. There's a particular river in South Wales, the Sir Howie, where there's an area that the children tend to wade in the river during the summer holidays, and we've got very big, strong PCB readings from there. And I've asked Natural Resources Wales to do, and the local council, to do a risk assessment of that stretch, and they're refusing to do it, or they were refusing to do it.
Presumably eating animals that come out of these rivers, you're exposing yourself to PCBs as well.
Absolutely, and as a fisherman that likes eating the odd trout, there are two stretches of the river where I'll no longer eat from. The big issues in my mind are whether flatfish from the Mersey and the Severn are actually fit to eat at the moment or not. I'm absolutely clear the Clyde you shouldn't eat any flatfish from the Clyde, but I'm not so clear about the Mersey and the Severn. And I wrote to the Food Standards Agency, and their response was so mealy-mouthed that you could just see all the alarm bells ringing in their minds, and then thinking, oh no, we can't actually give an all clear on this. But on the other hand, we can't give a categorical statement that there is a problem, because their funding is probably as vulnerable as other organisations in realpolitik.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any other initial questions from what we've heard so far? Now, do you want to tell us some more yourself off your own back?
Happy to be guided by the questions, Barbara.
Great. Okay. Right. So if you want to ask a question, either wave your hand in the air or put your virtual hand up. David, you come in. You got in there first. Off you go.
Thanks very much. We were just wondering, a magical new government comes in and they decide they've got money to sort out the problem. What would you do? What would need to be done?
Yeah, get the proper research done first, the proper testing. Most of the councils are deliberately doing the wrong kind of testing to make sure they don't find how bad it is. Then actually do testing of people who've been exposed. So the first lot would be the sediment of rivers and the levels in fish and waterside birds, and then do testing of people who are known to have been exposed. There are people who played on these sites as children. Chances are they're going to have elevated PCB levels. Now, it has multi-generational effects. There is a beginning of an inkling of research about. That's quite scary. And then actually complete containment of the sites. And containment is a word that I use as often as I can, and the councils use as infrequently as they can. It's fascinating how many of the councils talk about reducing the toxic flow into watercourses. Now, any toxic flow to me is likely to be significant, so the law is likely to be broken. So the fact that they say they want to reduce flows shows to me that they don't think they can actually stop the illegality themselves. Now, there's a specific set of legislation set up for that called the Environmental Protection Act, Part 2A. As soon as you classify these sites as contaminated land, then the responsibility for remediating them leaves the councils as regulators and goes to the Environment Agency and NRW. If they can't actually afford to remediate those with the known owners of the sites, there's a very good legislative path for actually going to the polluters and actually starting legal proceedings against the polluters to force the polluters to actually remediate the sites. Everyone's terrified of using that legislation, but it was put into law precisely to be used. So it's absolutely fascinating to me. They did it in America, and yet there's such a strong steer being given in this country to stop it happening. So breaking through that massive, conscious, deliberate national logjam would be the next thing as well.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in there with my question because it follows on from that. Should you and you other brave campaigners manage to get action from our government and the companies concerned, is it possible? What can you do? What should be done?
Yeah.
What should be done?
Yeah, I'll come to that in just a minute. I should have said, of course, that if a Labour government comes in, the problems are going to continue because it was under a new Labour government that the cover-up started. So I don't hold out any hopes post-election in that sense. But what should be done? Complete containment was recommended by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution in 1990. I've seen their documentation. They say this is such an extreme pollution issue that tinkering around the edges, I mean, it's lovely the way they put it. They say it's just going to leave problems for future decades, which of course it has. So they actually recommend that each of the sites needs to be excavated and the stuff taken away and dealt with in a completely contained environment. And I mean, we know that's going to be messy, but the alternative is just letting it trickle down the hillside into villages and streams for the next 50 to 100 years. So there are no simple alternatives, Barbara. The best way probably in some of the sites is to actually make them completely contained and then have a leachate capture chamber and then have lorries taking away the leachate to Ellesmere Port for it to be incinerated at ultra high temperature. That's 1400 degrees that breaks down the PCB. But a lot of these places are on hillsides, and complete containment in situ would take a lot of organizing. But, you know, if you think $2 billion has been spent on this in America, this should be a major engineering works project. And I think some of the professional bodies are now waking up to that. But they're scared because they're based on membership fees, you know, and I think there's probably been illegality from some of the consultancy companies. I better not name them here. But, you know, some of the professional companies get a lot of their day-to-day expenditure from those, you know, the professional organizations get their day-to-day expenditure from those companies and from membership fees. So they're getting scared now themselves.
Right. I'm going to ask, thank you, Paul. I'm going to ask Mary to share something she shared with us in our group, because I don't know about how the other groups felt, but certainly the breakout group I was in, we were quite shocked and horrified of and what you were telling us. Mary, would you like just to read us what you read in our group?
Yes, it's from Richard Muir's reflections from last week, which was about anger and really, yeah, because I just felt outraged by what you said, Paul, and I just also want to say thank you very much. Thank God for you, that you're, you know, for your hard work and dedication and, you know, courage. Yes. So anyway, this is what, this is what I read. Well, it was from the reflection. Faced with an outrage, anger is the price we pay for paying attention. It is the rage that ought to come out, because when faced with an outrage, it is a sin not to be angry.
Yeah, that's lovely. And as someone who's always drawn a lot of strength from the Franciscan tradition, it's so nice to hear. The issue to me, I don't know if it's a virtue or a vice in different parts of life, but I've always been someone who channels anger through my mind to try and do something about the issues, you know, whether it's working on behalf of gypsies who are being set up in Telford by the local council, or people who are being chased for mortgage arrears, not even of their own making, by PricewaterhouseCoopers partners. And I try to channel it and try to form strategies of response. It's quite personally costly, I must say. It's very, very costly, and in more ways than I can actually say in an open forum. But the anger is right, and standing up. I mean, the poor farmer at this site in Cheshire that I was describing, there was an ITV documentary about the site where he was. And there was all this stuff going on behind the scenes between different ministers. And then one minister puts in writing to the local MP that this is too difficult to handle. So they're not going to give them a grant. So they just let the stuff carry on rolling into the stream and over his field. Now, I just feel complete outrage over that. And it caused a lot of family angst for them. And it's nice to be doing some therapeutic work with them at the moment. But the anger that I mostly have is against the regulators, because they're supposed to be on our side, aren't they? And yet what do? The Environment Agency cancels a meeting that they'd scheduled for me with their senior chemicals advisor, when I actually ask for it to be a dialogue, not a monologue. They cancel the meeting at about 72 hours notice. And I've been trying to get that meeting rescheduled for over 4 years now, and they won't have it. Natural Resources Wales, I had an email from them yesterday saying that they weren't going to answer any more of my inquiries because I'm somehow vexatious. It's not vexatious, it's diligent to be following through on this stuff. And so anger comes in a number of different directions, some about oneself, some about the situation on others, some about just the structural injustice of it all. And I really want to do something about it. That's why I set up the crowdfunding page with my friends. And there's this village in South Wales, Innisthea. I hope I've got the pronunciation of that right for anyone Welsh here. And the stuff's been trickling through their village. I've watched it go down their roadways. Their allotments were closed down because of it. There's PCB readings in the wildlife in the river. So we know it's reached the river. And yet they're claiming that the source site 200 metres up the hillside isn't contaminated land. It's an outrage, an absolute outrage. And they've got this tame consultant, Arcadis, who didn't tell them that there was a legal offence going on when they did a consultancy 6 or 7 years ago, who've now just been re-employed to do more tests. And I'm thinking, and I will put this on record, it was a misfeasant consultancy that was done, and yet they've been given the follow-up contract because they're known to be tame. And I've got an email from the council actually telling the consultants what diameter of pipe they want to put below the site. And I'm thinking, the consultants should have been telling the council that the diameter of pipe wasn't big enough, and then maybe we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. So, and just this sense of outrage amongst the local councillors and all the other locals there is just, it's off the scale. One councillor, there was an overflow event at the beginning of January, and bless her, she went and stood outside to ask to be allowed into the site to see what was going on while there were all these guys and gals in white suits. They wouldn't even let her in. No one thought to offer her a mask. And she was in bed for 2 days afterwards because the fumes had been so bad, because it had overwhelmed the manhole cover and it was coming up into the atmosphere with VOCs, volatile organic chemicals. And she was in bed. And yet we've got a thing from Public Health Wales saying there's no public health issues here. So pipe down, we don't know what you're talking about. So so anger is very apposite. Thank you.
Anybody else want to come in? Terry, like to unmute yourself.
Paul, I'm horrified, but has there been any media interest and campaigns on this?
Yeah, I've had 2 features on Country File about it. The Press Association took it up, and that got us into syndicated media like The Independent. But the councils are just playing a complete blocking response because they know that DEFRA doesn't want them to give territory on it. I've done a number of public meetings in Innisthea, near Hereford, at Coalbrookdale, and I've got another one in Cheshire a bit later this month. But the councils just know how big it is, and they know that the government doesn't want EPA Part 2A to be triggered. In fact, the Environment Agency, there's even a slideshow that I saw a copy of on the internet where they list all the reasons in a particular slide why people shouldn't classify these sites as contaminated. Amusingly, after I pointed that up to the West Midlands Environment Agency office, it disappeared off the internet. The layers of cover up here are multiple. I guess I'm enough among friends here. I may as well tell you what's happening. Radio 4 has commissioned a 10-part series into it for broadcast in June. I'm a bit worried that the government's going to issue a D notice to try and spike the whole series, but we haven't seen any sign of a D note because post-war World War II munitions containing PCB were actually dumped off the side of ships in various parts around the UK. So the government may well try to issue a D notice. But the government, the BBC's lawyers have been working with us since October. And at the beginning of April, there's going to be a fleet of letters that are going to go out to various councils, regulators, and to DEFRA. And then the shit will really hit the fan. So we've got some of the interviews with whistleblowers in the can already. There's a particularly influential one from down in Herefordshire, which shows that the situation there was actually spiked at quite high level Masonic involvement. We've got another whistleblower who's going to be going on record, hopefully fairly soon. I'm not sure if I should call him a whistleblower or not, but he's a former Environment Agency high-level specialist about all this. There's another one who actually works for a company, Veolia, who's up to their necks in this. But the best of all is the academic from Newcastle University is actually going on record about the threats to his funding. Brave man, really brave man. Hold him in your prayers.
I think we need to indeed hold you all in our prayers. Judith.
Are there any maps that people can access to see how close they might be to any of these waste sites?
Yeah, I persuaded the Press Association chap to do one for me. I feel a bit guilty about it, to be honest, because I got him to do it and it's quite neat. And then none of the papers actually used the map he'd spent so long actually forming. But yeah, I'd imagine the BBC will be putting something out as well. But I've got a basic one, but it's basically up and down the border strip, and then Boreham Wood on the Colne, Teesside, anywhere near Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, Bennett's Bank in Cumbria, about 5 miles north of Hereford, Sutton Walls, the old hill fort site. That hill fort has been backfilled with a whole load of toxic chemicals, including PCB, and it's leaked out underground and it's coming up in various places. But of course, it's not significant enough to be classified as contaminated land, is it? Oh no. Yeah. So those are the main places that I know of. There are some more, but I think those are the main ones, really. And all these places around South Wales. I mean, yeah, there's about 10, I estimate, sites that I haven't found yet around the South Wales valleys. And I think I know where a number of them are, but I can't document it yet. So yeah, there may be somewhere in the New Forest as well, but I can't get the documentation of that tidied up.
Catherine, you were about to come in when you left us suddenly.
Paul, you were saying earlier, and you may have covered this now, that so these agencies that just are so unresponsive, I wanted to ask you, can you bypass them to the walls of the Senedd? Or go
that's been the second string strategy, and it's really interesting. Welsh Labour won't touch me with a barge pole, and I still don't know whether that's on National Labour instructions or whether it's just the complacency of a ruling power. But Plaid Cymru has come up trumps. Their environmental lead, I've had a number of meetings with Delyth Delyth Jewell, Peredur Owen Griffiths, even a Conservative member of Senedd, Natasha Ashgar, did get involved until she realised Plaid were making the running, and then she seems to have backed off a bit. But all the Welsh Labour members of Senedd, it's really, really interesting. It's more than coincidence. So just last week, we finally managed to get enough penetration that we got the right questions asked of Mark Drakeford himself. We hadn't managed to pin him down, but we got him on the floor of Senedd having to give a statement about the situation at this place above the village in Isthie. We've had public protests when the Minister for Climate Change came there and all sorts of things. And the Minister for Climate Change has obviously decided it's too hot to handle and has passed it upstairs to Mark Drakeford. So that felt a bit of a breakthrough. It's just a shame that he's standing back at this election. So, we lose the purchase hold we've got. But bizarrely, the person who seems to be handling it within the executive of Welsh Government is a former contaminated land officer from Newport at the very time when they decided it was, quote, not a priority to check whether the biggest PCB factory site in Europe was contaminated land. Can you believe it? So, but it's obviously his managers that are managing the troublemakers like me, and so I'm trying to be very careful not to angle in on him because he'd be too easy a target to take out. I think this is so high level. It goes into the House of Lords. There's some of the Lords are involved. I can say on record, Viscount Chris Mills, who's now chair of Forthcoming Cymru, was a central character. I'm not saying he was a central character in the cover-up. I'm saying he was a central character in the Environment Agency Wales response at a time of considerable controversy. Let's put it there. But of course, the Forthcoming Cymru are terrified of losing their funding because Natural Resources Wales give them project funding. So the chair of the DEFRA Select Committee is aware of it, Sir Robert Goodwill, but he's compromised by his constituency being very close to the Tees and him being a part of let's say the containment operation over the wildlife die-offs there. I can't put it any stronger than that, but you can read between the lines. So would it be appropriate for me to share a little bit about some of the spiritual dynamics here? Because trying to speak truth to power as a lowly curate when I first discovered this stuff in Telford, and then gradually building an alliance around myself of academics, company whistleblowers, conventional environmental activists, and concerned locals. It's been quite an interesting piece of liberation theology in a way. It's felt like building a voice for the powerless. And one of the things which has only really become evident over the last couple of years is how many little groups of powerless there are around the site who didn't know that the others existed. It's actually very akin to the post office scandal in that sense. It was only when I started to introduce people to each other that, like Mr. Bates having that meeting in the church, in the village hall, that we started to develop a bit of clout, really. That's one observation. The second observation is how I said it's been costly. I'm a natural contemplative. I don't welcome these things. In fact, I remember giving a talk to another Barbara and associated people in the marches. I think it was the Christian Ecology Link group, although it may have been Christian Socialist Movement, specifically about contemplation and action. And then I had more energy left for contemplation. This is because snowballed so much. The actions had to take primacy, and that has felt very costly. I'm a quiet guy, and an introvert, and it takes a lot out of you. Organising meetings, squaring up to officials, dealing with spurious FOI refusals, generating interest in new sites and that sort of thing. And that feels a very Lenten journey. I'm offering this for the good of caring for creation. The BBC team are actually, I've got an archive now of more than 250 documents that I've given them for future use. And they're deliberately going to put that in an archive because they think there will be future generations that will want to look back to it. It's lovely being part of that, but goodness me, it takes a toll. So I look forward to getting back to a contemplative approach. I love who was the Archbishop that said, I do 1 hour a day contemplation. If I've got a particularly busy day, I start with 2 hours contemplation. I wish I had that strength of mind. But it's lovely being part of organisations like CEL and CSM, as it was, Christians on the Left now, and Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace. Greenpeace have done a load of free testing for us through Exeter University, which enabled me to get positive PCB records on file where companies have been claiming it was all negative for decades. Another spiritual thing is the issue, the overall issue of intergenerational justice. I've mentioned that report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution in 1990. The old agencies were so much more honourable than the new ones. The National Rivers Authority wrote brilliant reports. We just don't get them now. Instead, we get things that say all the right jargon, but the heart's not in it. And they seem to find no compunction about perjuring themselves. I've been terribly naive. It took me ages to realise how easily the regulator lies. I thought regulators would be reliable. It's quite the opposite. I've had more lies from the regulators than from any other bodies concerned. All back covering stuff. In spiritual terms, again, that's costly, but it's about human nature, isn't it? And I mean, and now, 25 years ago, when I started as a vicar, the doctrine of the fall seemed very out of fashion and liberal optimism was carrying the day. I think now people are realizing far more, aren't they, about the fallen nature of humanity. And if anyone wants to come back to me on that, to refine any of those observations, I'd really welcome some more questions.
I think we're just lost in admiration of what you're doing, Paul, and understand what you're saying.
That's very kind of you to say, Barbara.
We can certainly include you in our prayers, which we will. We'll look out for your programme. But has anybody anything they'd like to contribute on that might be of comfort and strengthening to Paul? You've opened our eyes to, I mean, we're all pretty seasoned environmentalists who are pretty well aware of a lot of the things that are going wrong in the world. But I must have to say, I've certainly been shocked by the extent of what you've been able to expose. And I think the one kind of hopeful thing I've got from what you've been saying, Paul, is that you're no longer on your own doing this, are you? Yeah. You seem to have accumulated a good number of very helpful, useful allies, and have got the BBC also interested in this. Let's hope that does go ahead. We can obviously publicise that series when it comes out and encourage our members to listen in and do something about it.
Yeah.
Are there any other ways in which Green Christian?
Yeah. Well, if I tell you that the academic from Newcastle, the security department at Newcastle University, is so scared for his safety that whenever he's on Teesside, he's obligated to ring in every half hour. That's how scared they are for his physical well-being at the moment. Then, holding people in prayer in that situation is really important. I come back. I loved at theological college the Catholic social teaching, And they really did give some mileage to the idea of the common good, didn't they?
Yes.
I mean, and I've loved that, carrying that with me on my journey and finding that the breadth of goodwill is so wide, and that's been a lovely theological thing for me. And also how many people of faith, some of them disappointed ex-Christians, some of them still worshipping at the margins, some having left the more dogmatic faiths to go into Quakerism, and you know, people finding their pathway through. I don't know if you remembered, Barbara, there was a lovely letter written by a little 16-year-old girl in response to something that CL did, saying, why doesn't everyone know more about this? And I replied to her and left it at that. But I often wonder what happened to that girl, because if she had such an awareness, even at that tender age, and there's untold numbers of people coming through now, aren't there, with similar kind of awareness because of how good our education system is now ecologically. And that's such a cause of rejoicing. You know, organizations like CEL are, I think, occupy a quiet midwife role to so many of those people, don't they? Because I remember she was quite distressed at the time, and she was saying, why aren't people noticing this enough? Because I've seen it. And I thought, good on you. You know? So the more links we can make back to all those sort of people, I think it's great, and continue to resource them as CEL does so well.
I should just explain for newer members of Green Christian, CEL is what we used to be, Christian Ecology Link.
Sorry, of course, yes.
But we changed it a while, but yeah, I mean that is that's one of the main things that we're here for, is to give some support, spiritual, moral, actual, in ways that we can and do. I'm going to pull this to a close, not because we don't want to hear more from you, but because we are coming to the end of our time.
Yeah.
And we're going
to end
with prayer. So I think that is one thing we can do. And Catherine is going to just share with us a prayer that she's prepared tonight. So, Catherine.
Yeah, let us pray. Lord God, thank you for the freedom in which we have listened to hard, dirty, uncomfortable truths. Help us to use our freedom to speak out for the collective good and the good of the earth, to stay informed and prepared to speak out. Help us to be willing to pay the price of anger, and we pray that that price will include pressure until it affects political will to deliver on accountability, regulation, enforcement and remediation. Lord, be with Paul tonight, and for the continuation of his journey in you and in all of this. And finally, may God bless us all with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression and exploitation of people, so that we may work for justice, freedom and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger and war, so that we may reach out our hand to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in the world, that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to the land, to all our children and the poor. Amen.